It was a cold morning in Northern Virginia, the kind of cold that bites deep into old scar tissue. I pulled my worn field jacket tighter around me, leaning slightly on my carbon fiber cane. I wasn't supposed to be here, not in this capacity. Usually, when I visited Defense Systems Acquisition and Logistics, the red carpet was rolled out. It was polished marble and hushed tones. But today, I was just Elias Vance, a man needing a specific custom component for his vintage motorcycle project. Something I kept up to remind myself that my hands could still build, not just sign mandates. The place, Global Tech Supply, was spotless, almost sterile. They specialized in high tolerance alloys, mostly feeding into major military subcontracts. $40 million worth of annual business funneled straight through my office. Gordon, the owner, met me at the counter. Gordon was exactly what you pictured. Tailored suit, expensive watch, a permanent expression of practiced condescension. He didn't look at me. He looked at the cane, then the scuffed boots. "Can I help you, sir?" His tone suggested I was interrupting something important, probably a golf tee time. I slid the schematic across the polished granite counter. "I need this spec cut in Thai 6L4V, rush order. I know you have the stock." Gordon didn't even glance at the complex blueprint. He pushed it back toward me with the tip of a manicured finger. "We don't do walk-ins for bespoke parts, especially not titanium. This kind of material runs thousands. Just for the block. We work with established accounts." "I understand that," I said, keeping my voice low. "It takes more energy to argue than to be silent. A lesson learned years ago under much heavier fire. My account isn't established with you, but I assure you, payment is guaranteed. Priority status, if possible." He finally looked at me, really looked, sizing up the quality of my jacket, estimating my probable income bracket. He found it wanting. "Priority status, huh? Look, buddy, we supply the Pentagon. We don't run a community fabrication shop. You understand the cost of setting up this kind of precision tooling?" "I have a good understanding of government spending," I replied, allowing a small dry smile. He scoffed. "Oh, I'm sure you do. Everyone thinks they know about government spending until they see the invoice." I decided to try the route of expediency. I pulled out my ID card wallet, flipping it open to show my official Department of Defense civilian ID, which clearly identified me as Elias Vance, Undersecretary, and underneath it, laminated and slightly faded, my VA medical card and my service identification. I pointed specifically to the notation for my military service and the small, distinct gold outline indicating my status as a 100% service-connected disabled veteran. I was hoping for a professional courtesy, Gordon, or at least the standard federal discount on materials. "This is for a personal project, but the materials often track with your existing DoD inventory." Gordon snatched the wallet before I could pull it back entirely. He ignored the Undersecretary ID. He saw only the veteran documents. His eyes narrowed, moving from my ID to my cane. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. "Oh, a vet. I see. Trying to pull rank, are we? Expecting the world to bend because you broke your back jumping out of a perfectly good plane." The air in the sterile room seemed to drop 20 degrees. That statement hit me, not because it was insulting, but because it was so utterly dismissive of 25 years of dedicated service, years spent sacrificing comfort, family time, and the complete use of my left leg. "It wasn't a plane," I corrected him calmly. "It was a compound fracture and internal shrapnel during a counter-raid operation outside Mosul. It resulted in a Purple Heart and 2 Silver Stars, none of which, I assure you, I mentioned for discounts." Gordon let out a short, barking laugh. He tossed my wallet back onto the counter. The metal clatter sounded deafeningly loud. "Purple Heart, Silver Star. Aren't those cute little trinkets? What good are those medals today, Vance? Do they pay for the titanium? Do they suddenly make your motorcycle project important to my bottom line? They're great for getting a free coffee on Veterans Day, but they don't buy materials worth $20,000. He leaned over the counter, his tone dropping into a poisonous whisper, his breath smelling of expensive coffee and entitlement. I bet you tell everyone about the limp, don't you? Just hoping for a little pity money. The fact is, sir, medals are debt. They mean you cost the government money, you don't earn it. Now, unless you can show me a verified account with a minimum six-figure draw, you need to step aside. I have real federal contracts to manage. I stood perfectly still. My training took over. Every fiber of my body wanted to tear that smirk from his face. But 20 years in the acquisition office teaches you that true power is leverage, not physical force. I looked down at the schematic he had rejected. Then I looked at the man who had just openly, brazenly mocked the highest sacrifice a soldier could give. You mentioned federal contracts, Gordon, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Yeah, I did. Huge ones. We just finalized the quarterly supply review for the Titan project components. 40 million, running through Q3 next year. Why? He straightened his jacket, swelling with perceived importance. I'm just curious about your supplier vetting process, I continued, picking up my ID wallet and carefully placing the undersecretary credential face up on the counter. Specifically, your adherence to the department's ethics standards regarding contractor conduct and professional decorum toward service personnel. Gordon frowned, finally registering the title printed in bold blue ink beneath my photo. Elias Vance, Undersecretary of Defense, Acquisitions and Sustainment, the man who signed his purchase orders, the man who approved the Titan project funding. The arrogance evaporated from his face, replaced by a ghastly, immediate pallor. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. I didn't wait for him to apologize or stammer out an excuse. That moment of searing injustice, the calculated humiliation meant to remind me of my place, was now a cold stone in my gut. You're right, Gordon, I said, my voice steady, pulling on my gloves. Those medals don't pay for the titanium, but I control the budget that pays for your entire operation, and I have a very, very long memory regarding individuals who confuse service with begging. I gathered my cane and my rejected schematic. I hadn't finished my transaction, but I had finished my assessment. I needed to make a call. The injustice burned. I needed to know exactly how much damage I could legally inflict and how quickly. I walked toward the exit, leaving Gordon frozen behind the granite counter, his multi-million-dollar life suddenly balancing on the thin edge of my silent fury. My phone rang as I hit the parking lot. It was my executive assistant, Marcus. Sir, the quarterly contractor ethics review meeting has been moved up. You scheduled it for 1400 hours today. Good, I said, looking back at the sterile building. Tell legal to prepare the full compliance audit package for Global Tech Supply. And Marcus, add a note. Emphasize Clause 31.4, Professional Conduct and Ethical Representation in dealing with department personnel. I want zero loopholes. The cold morning air felt sharper now. The pain in my leg was irrelevant. The only thing that mattered was the quiet, absolute decision I had just made. Gordon had called my service debt. He was about to learn the true cost of disrespecting a man who signs the checks. The game had just begun. I felt the familiar, dull burn rise immediately in my chest, not the residual pain from the shrapnel lodged near my hip. This was the acid of disrespect. It hit deeper than any physical wound ever could. Victor hadn't just insulted me. He had insulted the ghost of every soldier I had ever lost. He scoffed at the memory of Ramadi. He mocked every mile marker on the road of my recovery. He looked right at my cane, leaning carelessly against the high marble reception desk. He tapped it lightly with the toe of his highly polished Italian leather shoe. Move along, old timer, he sneered, loud enough for the three sharp-suited associates behind him to hear. They chuckled on cue, a canned, brittle noise that echoed off the expensive vaulted ceiling. Some of us have actual business to conduct here, Victor continued, adjusting his bespoke cufflink. Big boy contracts. We don't need walking charity cases looking for a free coffee refill distracting the procurement staff. He waved a dismissive hand, turning his back entirely. It was a gesture of complete, total erasure. He had no concept of what that medal represented. Victor saw cheap metal, tarnished ribbons, and an inconvenience blocking his path to the next million. I saw blood drying instantly on Iraqi desert sand. I saw Specialist Ruiz, a kid barely out of high school, taking the worst of the blast meant entirely for me. I remembered the desperate ringing silence right before the medevac helicopters finally arrived. I earned that limp, dollar by painful dollar, under fire. I didn't get it sitting comfortably in an office chair shuffling papers. That Purple Heart was the undeniable currency of my life's sacrifice. And this man treated it like a poorly minted subway token. Victor didn't stop there. He felt emboldened by the lack of immediate resistance. He needed to establish dominance. Seriously, someone needs to tighten up security in this wing, Victor muttered, angling his voice so the reception staff felt the pressure. We can't have vagrants wandering into the Federal Acquisitions meeting space. It looks terrible for my firm, Aegis Systems. His associates nodded along, their faces set in expressions of smug practiced pity mixed with deep boredom. This was a power play. Humiliating the person he perceived as the weakest, the poorest, or the most inconveniently disabled was always his opening move. It made him feel bigger. I felt my heart rate slow down, paradoxically. The adrenaline left, replaced by a deep chilling clarity. I adjusted the lapel of my jacket. The movement was measured, precise, almost surgical. I reached into the inner breast pocket, the secret pocket only tailors and senior staff know about, and pulled out the device. It was a small encrypted government phone, matte black and heavily secured. It wasn't the kind of phone you could buy at any retail store or even order online. It felt dense, cold, and undeniably official in my palm. Victor glanced over his shoulder, annoyed that I hadn't simply vanished as ordered. "Are you taking a selfie, Grandpa?" he barked. I said, "Get out, or I'm having security physically remove you. We have a major presentation in 4 minutes." I ignored him entirely. I raised the phone to my ear and dialed a very specific extension. It was 4:58 p.m., 2 minutes before the scheduled deadline for his company's $40 million contract approval. A calm, highly professional voice answered instantly. My executive assistant, Janice. "Secretary Marcus? We thought you were already in the conference room." I kept my voice low enough that Victor had to strain slightly to hear it, but steady enough that the tone cut through the noise of the lobby. "I'm slightly delayed, Janice. A small, unscheduled security issue has occurred. I need you to pull the documentation for Project Chimera immediately." A profound silence stretched across the expensive lobby. "Carpet!" Victor stopped laughing. His chief legal associate, a man named Henderson, frowned sharply, cocking his head. Henderson looked like a man who suddenly heard the distant sound of an air raid siren. Project Chimera. That was the name of the cutting-edge software integration contract. The one that was supposed to be rubber-stamped in 5 minutes. The one belonging entirely to Victor's company, Aegis Systems. I looked directly at Victor now. The slight, arrogant smile was gone. The casual, dismissive posture had evaporated. Sweat was just starting to bead along his upper lip, visible only if you knew exactly where to look. He realized the name of the project. He was beginning to recognize the sound of my voice. "Hold that entire package, Janice," I said into the secure phone. My eyes never left Victor's. Tell General Sterling that the Chief Acquisition Officer needs a 5-minute extension. I have a pressing question for the CEO of Aegis Systems regarding his firm's value alignment and security protocols before we sign anything at all. I hung up the phone. The deadline clock had stopped. Victor knew it, but he didn't yet know why. Not fully. He just saw the crippled veteran he had just humiliated, holding the power he craved most. His face went pale. Who are you?" he finally managed, his voice cracking slightly on the last word. I tucked the heavy phone back into my pocket, leaned slightly on my cane, and finally, slowly, I smiled. It was not a kind smile. "I am the man who signs the checks, Victor." Sterling leaned closer, his face glossy, with that particular brand of arrogant certainty only unchecked power can bestow. "Look, buddy," he sneered, his breath smelling faintly of expensive coffee. "You got a limp. Sure, we all have issues, but don't wave those trinkets around here like they automatically buy you respect. Trinkets. The word was a specific surgical strike. It sliced deeper than any direct insult about my clothes or my presumed income level. He wasn't just insulting my choice of attire. He was insulting the life I almost lost in the dust of Kandahar. He was insulting the memory of Sergeant Reynolds, who took the worst of the shrapnel for me that day. The sergeant who never walked again. I felt the familiar heat rising in my neck. It was the heat of righteous, deeply suppressed rage. The kind I hadn't let surface since I was a young lieutenant, still learning the difference between necessary anger and pointless aggression. I adjusted my cane, trying to anchor myself in the physical discomfort, distracting myself from the emotional assault. Sterling naturally continued, oblivious to the fact that he was drilling holes into a minefield. He was consumed by the sound of his own booming voice and the perceived power of his Savile Row suit. "You probably think, because you served, the world owes you something," he scoffed. "It doesn't. This shop costs real money. We deal with people who matter." He glanced around the pristine, minimalist waiting area, emphasizing how obviously I didn't belong in such surroundings. "People who run things. People who sign big checks." He paused for dramatic effect. "We're talking defense contracts, friend. $40 million deals?" He threw the figure out like a challenge, a dollar sign used as a verbal weapon. It was meant to remind me of the sheer chasm separating his world of wealth and influence from my world of military pensions and frayed denim. "You see this place?" he asked, gesturing grandly at the high ceilings and custom tile. "This exists because the U.S. government trusts Ether Dynamics. They trust me." He tapped his chest with a smug, self-satisfied finger. He was bragging about taking huge contracts from the very system I had dedicated 25 years to protecting, while actively mocking the permanent injury I had sustained protecting it. The irony was crushing. The universe had delivered the exact perpetrator and the exact motive for retribution straight into my quiet Tuesday afternoon. I forced myself to speak, my voice low and carefully controlled. It was almost a whisper, intended only for him. "Ether Dynamics." I repeated the name slowly. Sterling rolled his eyes. Impatient now. He clearly felt he had made his point and wanted me gone. "Yes, the company that pays my salary, and frankly, allows me to employ half the state. Now, get your truck fixed, pay the technician, and don't clog up the entrance with your cheap props." He turned to walk away, assuming the conversation was over. His dismissal was absolute, definitive. But the name of the contract, Ether Dynamics, was the key. I knew that name. I knew the specifics of their request for proposal, filed under the classified code name Chimera 7. I knew they were already 6 weeks late on their first technical deliverable milestone. And I knew that the contract's continuation review was scheduled for 8 a.m. sharp tomorrow morning, on my desk, in my office. I watched his back as he moved toward the heavy glass door of his private chamber. This wasn't just about an insult anymore. This was about principle. This was about every veteran who had ever been dismissed, ignored, or exploited because they didn't look like they mattered. My hand instinctively moved to the inner breast pocket of my faded denim jacket. The crisp edges of my government ID felt sharp against my fingers. A cold promise. No, not yet. He needed to understand the full magnitude of his mistake before I lowered the boom. "Mr. Sterling," I said. My voice was suddenly steady. It was cold. It held the quiet authority of a general who has just issued an irreversible command. He stopped, annoyed by the interruption, clearly furious I hadn't simply disappeared. He twisted his head slightly, glaring over his shoulder. "I hope your contract review goes smoothly tomorrow morning," I continued, softly. A sudden, sharp silence fell over the high-ceilinged room. Even the faint keyboard tapping from the receptionist stopped instantly. Sterling froze completely. He slowly turned back around, suspicion instantly replacing his arrogance. He looked like a predator who had just realized he was standing in a trap. "Excuse me," he asked. His tone had irrevocably changed. It was cautious, fragile. I leaned heavily on the cane, maintaining the unassuming image of the injured soldier. Only now I allowed a small predatory smile to touch my lips. "The Chimera 7 RFQ," I explained calmly, maintaining eye contact. "The material fabrication requirement seems problematic, especially regarding the thermal dissipation coefficient specified in Appendix C, Section 4.2. His eyes went wide, reflecting the bright lobby lights. The arrogance shattered instantly, falling away like broken glass. That detail wasn't public knowledge. That detail was classified. It was internal to the Department of Defense. It was the precise technical point I was planning to grill him about in less than 20 hours. He stared at me, suddenly seeing not a limping man in cheap clothes, but a ghost who knew his deepest vulnerabilities. The game had ended. The justice was about to begin. The silence that followed his words wasn't heavy. It was razor-thin and terribly cold. It was the absolute quiet that descends when reality shifts violently. I stood there, feeling the familiar, constant ache in my left leg, a companion of 20 years. But the ache of his mockery was new. It was fresh and burning, a deep disrespect for every sacrifice that had brought me back home, damaged but whole. He had just belittled the symbol of the debt the nation owed its injured veterans, and he was doing it while running a business that relied entirely on those veterans to exist. He must have seen the quiet intensity in my eyes, but he misinterpreted it. He saw shock, perhaps, or wounded pride. He certainly didn't see calculation. He saw an opportunity to double down. "Look, friend," he said, pushing his hand through his perfectly sculpted hair. "I appreciate the sentiment. I truly do. But this isn't a museum for old combat stories. We run a tight ship here. If you need something specialized, I suggest you go through the official channels. That little ribbon," he pointed vaguely at where the Purple Heart pin would be, "doesn't get you a discount or preferential treatment in the private sector." The term "little ribbon," it hung in the air, echoing the shrapnel that had torn into my side and shattered my tibial plateau near the Khyber Pass. I thought about the 3 young men who were shielded by my body that day. Their lives were worth more than his casual, arrogant disdain. That ribbon was a receipt of service. He treated it like a participation trophy. I focused my gaze past his shoulder, toward a young man stacking boxes in the aisle, a low-level employee. The employee quickly dropped his eyes to the floor, terrified of meeting my stare. He was ashamed, not of me, but of the environment his boss had created. That was the turning point. It wasn't just about my personal injury anymore. It was about the institutionalized rot he represented. The exploitation of the military-industrial complex by men who felt entitled to profit, while openly scorning the very people who risked everything. For a split second, the urge to shed the disguise was overwhelming. To simply unbutton my coat, pull out the official DoD ID, and watch the color drain from his face as he realized he had just insulted the client who held his future in his hand. But I checked the urge. Revenge delivered in a moment of heat is satisfying, but fleeting. True justice required dignity, documentation, and authority. I took one slow, deliberate breath. "You have a good day, sir," I managed to say. The tone was completely flat, drained of emotion, which ironically gave the comment an ominous quality he was too self-absorbed to notice. He just smirked. "Yeah, I will. Try to keep the lobby clean on your way out." I turned, placing my hand on the counter edge to steady myself as I navigated the small step down. I made sure he saw the pronounced hitch in my gait, let him savor the visual confirmation of what he thought was my weakness. As I walked through the cavernous space, past pallets of highly sensitive equipment purchased with taxpayer dollars, my mind was already performing a deep dive audit. I wasn't seeing logistics anymore. I was seeing violations. The inadequate fire suppression system, the improperly labeled toxic materials, the lack of documented compliance checks I had noted in the initial report, all the minor infractions my office had flagged, which we were planning to grant extensions for, in the spirit of partnership. Partnership was now irrevocably broken. I reached the employee exit and pushed the heavy steel door open, stepping out into the gritty concrete service alley. The noise of the city muffled immediately. I pulled out the burner phone I carried, the one reserved only for the highest level of communication when I was in the field. I walked a dozen steps away from the building, letting the cold air clear my head of the dust and the foul energy of that place. I dialed my chief of staff, Major Thomas. He picked up instantly. "Undersecretary Vance, sir. Everything nominal?" he asked. "Nominal is relative, Major," I replied. My voice was low, clipped, and devoid of the casual warmth I usually afforded him. "I want you to cancel everything on my internal schedule for Tuesday. Clear the decks." "Sir, the Joint Chiefs budget review?" "Cancel it. Reroute the delegation to the Deputy Undersecretary." I cut him off. My word was final. My only priority is the 44B contract review meeting. Sterling's Logistics. I could hear Major Thomas flipping through files on the other end. "The 44B performance review. Sir, that's scheduled for renewal pending minor adjustments. I already had the papers prepared for sign-off." "Tear them up, Major. Prepare the comprehensive failure analysis instead." I leaned against the brick wall, staring at the back windows of the contractor's office, visualizing the desk of the man who had mocked my medal. I want every single breach of contract, every ethical lapse, every documented failure to meet compliance standards, even the ones we were inclined to forgive, aggregated into a single devastating presentation. There was a moment of silence. Thomas knew the tone. This wasn't a warning, it was an execution order. "Understood, sir. Are we anticipating resistance?" "Resistance is irrelevant. I will lead this meeting personally." I paused, letting the final demand sink in. This required serious political capital, but the Secretary of Defense had always stood behind his veterans. "And Major, you will contact the Secretary of Defense's office. Tell them I need 90 minutes on his calendar Tuesday morning. He will witness the contract 44B closeout meeting." I ended the call before Thomas could ask any more questions. I wasn't just going to terminate his contract. I was going to use his humiliation of me, a disabled veteran, to make an example that would reverberate through every defense contractor lobby in the country. He had $40 million riding on my good faith, and I had just left his facility with zero faith and a very large, quiet decision. Tuesday was coming, and Mr. Sterling was about to learn that sometimes the most unassuming person in the room is the one who holds the pen that signs your death warrant. He stood over me. His voice, slick with entitlement, was pure poison. He called the Purple Heart a nice little souvenir. He said my limp was probably exaggerated, just for the preferred parking spot. The way he looked at my combat ribbons, like they were cheap plastic toys I bought at a dollar store. I felt the heat rise, not just of anger, but of old, deep exhaustion. How many times do we have to earn the right to simply exist, to be respected in spaces we defended? He didn't wait for my response. He turned back to his associates, needing witnesses for his performance. "You see, gentlemen," he sneered, loud enough for the entire reception area to hear. "This is the cost of bureaucracy. Every government contract, every tax dollar has to feed 1,000 useless hangers-on." His associates chuckled, nervous and compliant. They didn't want to challenge the man who signed their paychecks. He was showing off, establishing dominance in the cruelest, most unnecessary way possible. He pointed a manicured finger at my chest, almost touching the metal. "You know," he continued, projecting confidence, "I run a $40 million operation here. We supply the cutting-edge systems that keep this country safe. Real work, not paperwork and collecting shiny badges." I took a slow, deliberate breath. I remembered what my father taught me. Rage is a luxury. Control is a weapon. I pushed myself up from the comfortable leather chair I had been resting in. The cane clicked against the polished Italian marble floor, a small, sharp sound in the sudden silence he created. I didn't argue about the medals. I didn't defend my leg. I chose a different battlefield entirely, one he thought he owned. "Mr. Sterling," I said. My voice was low, completely flat, without inflection. He flinched slightly at the sound of his name, surprised I even knew it. "Do you recognize the regulation governing integrated avionics system? 730B requirements?" He paused. His smile finally wavered. That was highly technical, almost proprietary knowledge. "Of course, I do," he scoffed, recovering quickly. "We built 730B. We own that program." "You own the rights to the intellectual property, certainly," I corrected him gently. "But the long-term funding structure for 730B is currently under mandatory review and performance audit." I watched his eyes search my face. Confusion was replacing the smugness. He didn't recognize me. "Who are you? Are you auditing us now?" he demanded, his voice tightening. "An auditor is far too junior for this assignment," I replied. I reached inside the breast pocket of my suit jacket, not for a weapon, but for a thin, laminated ID card. I held it up, just long enough for the corporate logo of the Department of Defense's highest oversight body to catch the bright overhead light. He leaned closer, narrowing his eyes, trying to read the fine print without leaning too far. "Office of Strategic Program Management," he read aloud. He dismissed it instantly. He needed to shrink me back down to size. "SPM? That's policy analysis. Paper pushers and analysts," he sneered. "You don't sign checks." He was desperate to believe I was small and irrelevant. "No, Mr. Sterling," I conceded, nodding slightly. "You are correct. I do not physically sign the checks." I let the silence sit there. I looked him straight in the eyes. "I decide if the checks are written at all." His face was starting to drain of color beneath the expensive tan he sported, but arrogance died hard in men like him. "Look, I don't know what game you're playing," he snapped, running a hand through his immaculately gelled hair. "But I have meetings, important ones." He gestured toward the far end of the reception area, trying to regain control of the physical space. "I need you to leave my facility immediately, or I will call base security for trespassing." I almost smiled at his confidence. He thought we were on his turf entirely. "Please do call them," I encouraged him easily. "They know me quite well." I looked at his associates now. They were frozen, watching him, not me, waiting for the powerful man to win this petty conflict. I pulled out my phone. I didn't dial anyone. I just brought up my highly restrictive private calendar. Speaking of meetings, Mr. Sterling, I said, my voice cutting through the thick tension. I see you have a 2 o'clock appointment today, marked as critical financial review. He recoiled slightly, his eyes narrowed with genuine alarm. How do you know that, if you're not an auditor? Because, I finished, the weight of 27 years of military service dropping into that single, calm word. That 2 o'clock appointment is no longer an internal review. It is the final, non-negotiable appropriation decision for the future of the 730B program. His hands started to shake, gripping the edge of the glass table behind him for support. The money was very real. The threat was immediate. He still didn't grasp the sheer height of the cliff he was standing on. He only understood that the crippled beggar he mocked seconds ago might hold the veto pen on $40 million of his annual revenue. He stammered my name, trying to place my face, my civilian title, in his internal database of threats and subordinates. But I had only given him the bureaucratic title, the one I used when traveling to review site performance, not the rank that came with the heavy guard detail waiting outside the complex, not the one that carried the full weight of the entire Department of Defense. Not yet. The humiliation was not yet complete. The fear was still just dawning. I stood there, leaning on my cane, letting him drown in that absolute, horrifying silence. The game had just changed completely. I was finally ready to go to work. I sat in the car for 20 minutes before I could start the engine. My hands were shaking, but not from fear. Not anymore. It was the cold, sudden realization of how far we still had to go. I had faced down generals, dictators, and hostile fire. I had survived 5 tours in places where the air itself was trying to kill you. Yet a man who built his fortune supplying cheap shelving units to the Department of Defense had just dismissed my entire existence. He had spat on the flag I wore on my shoulder. He had laughed at the Purple Heart given for shrapnel wounds I still felt every single morning. It wasn't just the insult to me, it was the insult to every service member, black, white, brown, who had ever put their life on the line and came home broken. If I, the Undersecretary of Defense, could be treated like a charity case by a civilian contractor profiting off our budget, what hope was there for a junior enlisted soldier? The injustice was staggering. It demanded more than anger. It demanded calculation. I drove back toward D.C., the memory of Mr. Sterling's smirk a burning brand in my mind. I didn't head to my home. I headed straight to the secure offices, the ones only 3 people knew about. I needed clarity. I needed information. The moment I was behind the firewall, I initiated the request. I asked my chief of staff, a brilliant young major named Kim, to pull the entire file on Sterling Enterprises, all DoD contracts, all bids, all pending renewals. I gave her no context. I just said it was urgent and sensitive. It took her 12 minutes to send the package. I opened the digital file. The irony hit me like a physical blow. Sterling Enterprises was almost entirely dependent on our funding. 92% of their revenue came directly from defense contracts. And there it was, the golden ticket, the $40 million logistics contract renewal, scheduled for review in 3 days. A crucial 5-year commitment to supply mission-critical components to NATO allies. It was the very lifeblood of Mr. Sterling's arrogant empire. He thought I was beneath him. He thought I was just a civilian who might complain to a manager. He didn't know he had insulted the one man who signed the checks, the one man who could starve his business in 30 seconds flat. I leaned back in the chair. The decision wasn't about if I would act, it was about how I would act. This could not be a simple petty act of bureaucratic revenge. I couldn't just have a deputy call him and cancel the contract. That would be too clean, too impersonal. This act had to serve a dual purpose: justice for the insult and a clear, chilling message to every contractor who views service members as expendable tools or inconveniences. They profit because of our sacrifices. They will respect our sacrifice. I closed my eyes and pictured the contempt in Sterling's face when he saw the Purple Heart ribbon. He didn't just hate the man in uniform, he hated the idea that I deserved that honor. He hated the black man who rose to a position of authority he felt should only belong to men who looked like him. My ancestors had endured worse just for wanting to look a white man in the eye. I had earned the right to look down from the top of the chain of command. I picked up the secure handset again. I didn't call Major Kim this time. I called General Hayes, my immediate supervisor, the Secretary of Defense himself. "Hayes," I said, my voice calm, flat. "I need your full support on an immediate procedural review. I need to cancel the Sterling Enterprises contract." Hayes knew me. He didn't ask if I was sure. He asked why. I gave him the details, omitting nothing of the public humiliation, the mockery of my combat wounds, the dismissal of my service. Hayes was a combat veteran too. He understood instantly. "The optics are sensitive, Marcus," he warned. "We can't make it look like we cancelled a major contract over a personal slight." "It's not a personal slight, General," I corrected him. "It's a foundational breach of military ethics. We entrust mission-critical components to this man. If he shows zero respect for the men and women who implement those missions, he is a risk to national security." I paused, letting the weight of the term national security settle. "Furthermore," I continued, "I want him in the room when the decision is finalized. I want to look him in the eye, and I want the legal counsel present, verifying that Sterling's public behavior constitutes moral turpitude sufficient to terminate the contract for cause." Hayes sighed, but there was a hint of satisfaction in the sound. "Set the meeting, Undersecretary. I'll make sure the lawyers are ready to justify the termination based on ethical conduct clauses. We'll cite his proven disrespect for military personnel as a lack of required integrity for managing sensitive logistics. $40 million gone." "Thank you, sir." I hung up and called Major Kim back. "Kim, immediate meeting scheduled for Aero 900 tomorrow," I dictated. "Pentagon Conference Room 1A. High priority. The agenda is the final review and negotiation of the Sterling Enterprises renewal contract." "Got it, sir. Who needs to be present?" "General Hayes, Chief Legal Counsel Reynolds, and Mr. Jonathan Sterling, CEO of Sterling Enterprises. Ensure Mr. Sterling understands his personal attendance is mandatory for finalization of the deal." I knew Sterling would jump at the chance. He thought he was coming to shake hands on $40 million. He would be strutting into the Pentagon, arrogant and superior. He would think he had won the small interaction at the store. He would think the veteran he mocked was powerless. I spent the rest of the evening studying the termination clauses, making sure the bureaucratic sword was surgically sharp. I laid out my dress uniform, the one with 4 stars on the shoulder boards, and the ribbon rack showing 30 years of dedication, sacrifice, and command. I looked at the Purple Heart ribbon, the small cloth square that Sterling had so easily mocked. Tomorrow, that square would be worth $40 million. I would wear the uniform, but I wouldn't speak a word of my rank until the exact moment of execution. I wanted Mr. Sterling to walk into that room and see the civilian he humiliated, the crippled veteran who asked for a simple courtesy. I wanted him to believe, until the final signature dried, that he was the powerful one. Tomorrow morning, Mr. Jonathan Sterling would learn the true cost of disrespect. He would learn what it means to mock a wounded man who just happens to control the entire budget of the Department of Defense. The stage was set. The curtain was ready to rise on the final, devastating act of poetic justice. I just had to wait for the morning light. The air felt heavy, metallic, charged with the unspoken terror of a man watching his empire crumble in real time. Davis stood frozen, unable to process the transformation. The limping, quiet veteran was gone. In his place stood an authority figure draped in the immense, quiet power of the Pentagon. You, you are mistaken, Davis stammered, his voice losing its pitch. This is a misunderstanding. I didn't know who you were. I didn't move. I didn't raise my voice. The calm was my strongest weapon now. That is precisely the point, Mr. Davis, I said. You didn't know who I was, but you felt entirely comfortable assuming who I wasn't. I adjusted my tie, feeling the weight of the moment settle on my shoulders. I was tired of fighting, but this fight, this precise moment of reversal, had been earned over decades of service and disrespect. I looked at Agent Henderson, who was standing like granite, holding my secure phone. Mr. Davis seems to require immediate clarification regarding the continuity of government operations, I instructed Henderson. Please retrieve the latest quarterly compliance report for Davis Integrated Systems, the one highlighting the unauthorized material substitutions on the M5 components. Davis's face went ash white. He knew exactly which report I meant. The corner-cutting report I had quietly flagged weeks ago, trusting the system to correct itself before I had to intervene. Now, intervention was necessary, personal, swift, and absolute. Sir, please, Davis pleaded, taking an unsteady step toward me. We can talk about this. I misspoke. I will issue a public statement apologizing to all veterans. I will double my charitable contributions. Just please don't look at the M5 components. That was an oversight, purely administrative. Administrative oversight, I repeated, letting the phrase hang in the cold air. The same oversight that might cause a communications array to fail during a hostile contact? The same oversight that could compromise the safety of the troops you claim to support? I shook my head. National defense contracting is not a game of administrative oversights, Davis. It is a matter of integrity, and you, today, demonstrated a profound and fundamental lack of integrity in every way possible. I took the secure phone back from Henderson. I didn't dial anyone high up. I dialed my immediate office, my chief of staff. This is Marcus, I confirmed softly. Initiate the immediate stop work order and funds freeze for Davis Integrated Systems, effective 0900 Eastern. Send the notification directly to Finance and Acquisition. Use the emergency clause. Demonstrated ethical failure, compromising the reliability of critical assets. The Chief of Staff's clipped professional response was barely audible, but Davis heard it clearly enough. The word freeze was a death sentence. Davis let out a strangled gasp, leaning his hands heavily on his knees, as if the floor had tilted. $40 million! He choked out, the number tearing from his throat like agony. You're killing my company over a few careless words? No, I corrected him calmly. I am upholding the standard of conduct required of every entity that draws oxygen from the Department of Defense budget. Your words were not careless, Davis. They were revealing. I stepped closer, ignoring the sweat beading on his forehead. You didn't just insult a Purple Heart, Davis. You insulted the contract. That medal, I gestured toward my chest, is the highest certification of sacrifice one can achieve in uniform. You openly mocked it. You demonstrated contempt for the very culture you profit from. If you lack the moral compass to respect the men and women who put their lives on the line, I continued, my voice gaining volume, how can the Department of Defense ever trust that you won't cut corners when those lives hang in the balance? He started hyperventilating, his eyes darting around wildly, searching for a lifeline, a way out of the trap he had sprung on himself. I need to call my attorney, he mumbled. You are free to do so, I acknowledged, but I advise you to inform him that the notification is already out. The process is irreversible at this stage. We don't negotiate integrity. I turned my back on him. I had made my decision weeks ago, but today he had given me the necessary public justification to act without hesitation. I walked toward the waiting black sedan. My cane found the concrete floor easily now. The pain in my leg hadn't vanished, but the weight of the humiliation had lifted, replaced by a cold, definite sense of justice delivered. Before stepping into the vehicle, I stopped and looked back at Davis one final time. He was still slumped, a defeated, middle-aged man who had just lost everything because he couldn't see past the color of my skin or the cane in my hand. I spoke one last time, addressing my staff, loud enough for Davis to hear the crucial detail. Ensure that the termination documentation highlights the immediate transfer of assets and intellectual property related to Project Guardian to General Dynamics by end of business today. We cannot risk a gap in operational readiness because of Mr. Davis's lapse in judgment. The car door opened, enveloping me in the silence of high-level security. The world outside, the world of petty racism and dismissed dignity, receded. The fight was won, but the paperwork was monumental. I leaned back in the seat, already thinking 3 steps ahead. The fallout from a $40 million contract termination required absolute precision. My chief of staff was awaiting confirmation. I raised the phone again. "It's done," I whispered. "Now, we brace for the political storm. I want the secretary fully briefed with all evidence before the stock market opens tomorrow. I want this to be a lesson, not just a termination." The car pulled out of the garage. Justice was served, but true closure required seeing the full consequences realized. The public exposure was still waiting, the full, undeniable accounting of the loss. That would be the final piece. The room air thickened to concrete. Bruce's face was the color of old ash. His expensive suit suddenly looked like a clown costume. He was shaking his head, a pathetic, slow-motion denial. Wait, Undersecretary Hayes, this is a joke, right? A test?" His voice cracked badly on the last word. I didn't blink. I did not move the cane. "Is the Purple Heart a joke, Mr. Sterling?" I asked. My voice was low. It carried across the silenced restaurant like a gunshot. "No, sir. Of course not. I was stressed. The quarterly report, the travel." He scrambled for excuses, throwing words against the inevitable. "You called me a charity case. You told me to get out of your way and stop clogging up the entrance, Mr. Sterling. You saw this medal, and you saw a burden you profit from, not a sacrifice you respect." He tried to step around the table, a jerky, desperate attempt to bridge the gap. "We respect the military, sir. Sterling Defense is 100% committed to the mission. I apologize for my tone. I apologize for the misjudgment of identity. It was rash." "It wasn't rash, Bruce. It was revealing." I leaned in, just slightly, letting him feel the full weight of the difference in our stations. When I sign off on a defense contract, I am signing away billions of taxpayer dollars and betting the lives of American service members on the integrity of the vendor. When you look at a fellow veteran and see only an obstacle, a drain, or an easy target for contempt, you demonstrate a fatal lack of integrity. The entire restaurant staff and every nearby diner were frozen. They had watched the entire escalating confrontation. Now they watched the collapse of a bully. "We can fix this, Secretary Hayes," he pleaded. "We can meet tomorrow. Lunch, dinner. We can renegotiate the terms of the upcoming Q2 deliverable. We can offer massive discounts. Anything." I pulled the slim official DoD binder from my jacket pocket. It was the preliminary review document for his next phase of drone components. I tapped the line that read, "Sterling Defense, proposed contract value, $40,150,000. I was planning to approve this within the hour. I informed him quietly. After I left this restaurant, I was headed straight back to the Pentagon. Bruce watched my fingers slide across the page. His eyes followed the path of the funding. Instead, I continued, I will be calling the secretary directly from the car. I will inform him that Sterling Defense displays an institutional culture hostile to veterans and lacking the moral fortitude required for national security contracting. He gasped. It was the sound of air escaping a collapsing balloon. You can't. You can't just kill $40 million over a misunderstanding about a knee injury. It was not a misunderstanding, Bruce. It was a character assessment, and you failed it spectacularly. I looked at his partner, the one who had stayed silent, paralyzed by terror. Sterling Defense relies on a deep trust that the people providing the tools are worthy of the mission. You proved today you are not worthy of the people. I stood up slowly, deliberately placing weight on the leg he had mocked. The cane was unnecessary now, but I held it as a symbol of the cost he disrespected. You need to understand something important about that wound, Bruce. Was paid for by the taxpayer, yes, but it belongs to me. It represents a promise I made to this nation, and when you look down on that promise, you spit in the face of everything your company purports to protect. I turned, giving him my back. I felt no rage, only a cold, powerful finality. When the Secretary of Defense calls you tomorrow morning, Mr. Sterling, you might want to consider telling him the truth. Tell him exactly why his undersecretary determined you are too small to handle a contract of that magnitude. I gave a curt nod to the waitress who had tried to intervene earlier. She looked at me, her eyes wide with respect and shock. "Thank you for your service, sir," she whispered. I simply nodded, making my slow, dignified exit, the echoes of Bruce's desperate, choked protests dying behind me. I reached the curb and stepped into the waiting black sedan. The driver, a young Marine, closed the door softly. I pulled out my secure phone. The dial tone was steady. "Get me the Secretary of Defense," I told the operator. "I have an urgent contract cancellation to discuss. $40 million, effective immediately." The city lights passed in a blur. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind only the quiet satisfaction of justice perfectly tailored. The money wasn't the goal. The dignity was. The secretary picked up immediately. "Hayes, what's so urgent?" his voice boomed. I settled back into the leather seat. "Sir," I stated calmly, "I've just concluded a preliminary review of Sterling Defense. The findings regarding integrity and reliability are unacceptable. We need to pull the 40 Milals Q2 contract immediately and launch a full audit into their historical performance." There was a pause on the other end. "That's a major shift, Jake. What triggered this?" I looked down at the purple heart pin still affixed to my lapel, shining under the streetlights. "A meeting, sir," I replied. "A deeply revealing meeting. We cannot afford to fund contractors who disdain the very men and women they are supposed to support. Trust me, Mr. Secretary. This decision saves us much more than $40 million in the long run." I knew what came next. The formal process. The inevitable firestorm Bruce would try to ignite. The calls to lobbyists. But the decision was made. The power had been exercised. The Purple Heart was vindicated. "I trust you, Jake," the secretary confirmed. "Start the termination paperwork immediately. I'll handle the fallout on this end." I hung up, the weight of the day settling on me. I looked out at the lights. It had been an ugly hour, but necessary. I touched the metal one last time, reminding myself that the only currency that truly mattered was respect. And some men, like Bruce, only learned that lesson when you took away everything else. The car moved silently toward the Pentagon, where the next fight waited. And I was ready for it. I always was.